Jane, a recent college grad, had moved into an old townhouse. It had a worn, eerie feel with creaky floors and dim lighting, but it was affordable and conveniently located. Despite the unease, she was excited about her new life. One evening while cleaning, she stumbled upon a dusty old trunk. Inside, she found an antique porcelain doll. It was dressed in a once elegant dress, now faded and tattered. Its porcelain face was cracked. Attached to the doll was a note that read, "Mary." Jane had always been fascinated by antiques. She admired the doll despite its eerie appearance. She placed it on a shelf in the living room, thinking it added a touch of vintage charm to her new home. That evening, Jane invited a few friends over to celebrate her move. Her home, though old, was cozy, and her friends admired the doll, but also felt some discomfort. "That doll gives me the creeps," one of her friends remarked. "Where did you find it?" "In a bedroom," Jane replied. "I think it's charming, in a weird way." As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to other topics, and the doll was forgotten. But as Jane's friends left and the apartment grew quiet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced at the doll, its eyes seemingly locked into hers. Unease gnawed at her, and she decided to text her friend Lisa, who had been disturbed by the doll. "The doll is seriously creeping me out," Jane wrote. "Same here," Lisa replied almost immediately. "You should get rid of it." Jane stared at the doll for a moment longer, then made up her mind. She picked it up, feeling its cold, cracked surface under her fingers. The feeling of being watched intensified. She carried the doll to the kitchen, grabbed a trash bag, and wrapped the doll tightly before taking it to the dumpster. She threw it in, hoping that would be the end of it. "There," Jane muttered to herself, "out of sight, out of mind." The unease began to fade, and she hoped that would be the end of it. Jane went to bed, trying to push thoughts of the doll out of her mind. She had barely fallen asleep when her phone rang. She checked the screen, an unknown number. Confused, she answered. "Hello?"
"It's Mary. I'm on the way,"
a childlike voice whispered. Jane sat up, her heart pounding. She quickly hung up, trying to calm herself. It must have been a prank call. But as she laid back down, the phone rang again.
"It's Mary. I'm closer now,"
the voice said, sending chills down her spine. Jane's hands trembled as she ended the call. She got up and checked all the locks, drawing the curtains tight. At midnight, the phone rang once more. Jane hesitated before answering, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello?"
"I'm right outside,"
Mary said. Jane immediately crept to the door and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. She backed away, her mind racing with fear. Suddenly, there was a soft knock on the door. Jane screamed, grabbing a kitchen knife as she backed into a corner. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the same unknown number.
"Let me in."
Tears streamed down Jane's face as she typed back, "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was immediate.
"You abandoned me. Now you must pay."
The lights flickered and the temperature in the room plummeted. Jane could see her breath as she looked around, clutching the knife tighter. Then she saw it. The doll stood in the distance, its eyes gleaming with malevolence. It moved slowly, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it approached her. Jane backed away, but the doll's gaze held her in place.
"Why did you leave me?"
the doll said without moving its mouth. "I'm sorry," Jane sobbed. "Leave me alone." The doll's face cracked further, a sinister smile spreading across its face.
"Too late."
With a sudden burst of speed, the doll attacked. Jane swung the knife, but it passed through the doll as if it were made of smoke. The doll's tiny hands reached her, grabbing her wrists with surprising strength. She screamed as the room around her seemed to dissolve. When Jane opened her eyes, she was no longer home. She found herself in a dark, endless forest, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Shadows danced around her. Jane looked down and saw her wrists were bleeding from where the doll had gripped her.
Welcome to my world.
Mary's voice echoed around her.
You will stay here forever.
Jane's breath quickened as she realized she was not alone. The forest was filled with grotesque, mutilated figures, their eyes glowing with a haunting light. They began to slowly move towards her. Jane remembered the knife and gripped it tightly, slashing at the figures as they drew near. Her strikes went through them, but it slowed their advance. Desperate, she ran through the forest, the grotesque figures trailing behind her. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Jane's legs burnt from the exertion. Suddenly, she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old house. With no other options, Jane sprinted towards the house, hoping to find refuge. As she reached the door, she glanced back. The figures were closing in, their forms becoming more defined, revealing their gruesome injuries and hollow eyes. Jane threw herself inside and slammed the door shut, bolting it with trembling hands. She backed away, clutching the knife, her eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. The house was filled with decayed furniture, cobwebs hanging from every corner. The air was thick with the smell of rot. She noticed a staircase leading down to a basement. With no other place to hide, she cautiously descended the creaking steps. The basement was dark and damp. In the center of the room was a large mirror, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Jane approached the mirror, her reflection barely visible in the dim light. She wiped the dust away, revealing the mirror's polished surface. As she stared into the mirror, the reflection began to change. The image of the doll appeared behind her. Jane spun around, but the room was empty. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed and swung the knife, but there was nothing there. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Jane felt herself being pulled towards it. She was pulled through the mirror, emerging into a twisted version of her home, where everything was dark and decayed. Mary appeared before her, no longer a doll, but a ghost.
You abandoned me. You will stay here forever.
Jane realized she had to play along if she wanted to survive. I'm sorry, Mary, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I didn't mean to abandon you. Let's play together. Mary's eyes gleamed with a sinister joy.
You want to play with me?
Yes, Jane replied, her mind racing for a plan. Mary grinned, her twisted face contorting in a horrifying expression.
Let's play hide and seek. If you can find me, I'll let you go. But if I find you, you'll stay here forever.
Jane nodded, trying to mask her fear. Mary vanished, leaving Jane alone. Jane knew she had to find a way to destroy Mary. She remembered the stories of malevolent spirits being bound to objects. The doll had to be the key. She frantically searched the apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She found the doll hidden in the shadows of the living room. She grabbed it, feeling a surge of malevolent energy. Mary screamed in rage as Jane held the doll. Mary shrieked, lunging at Jane. Jane swung the knife at Mary, distracting her long enough to run to the kitchen. She grabbed a lighter from the drawer, igniting it with shaking hands. Mary attacked her again, but Jane was ready. She set the doll on fire, the flames quickly engulfing it. A piercing scream filled the air as the house shook, the walls cracking and crumbling. Mary's form flickered and distorted as she cried in agony.
No, what have you done?
I've set you free, Jane said, watching as Mary's form dissolved into the flames. The room around her began to collapse, the twisted reality breaking apart. Jane felt herself being pulled back into the real world. She woke up on the floor of her home, the charred remains of the doll in front of her. The air was clear, the oppressive darkness gone. Jane knew she had to leave for good. She packed her belongings and left, determined to never return. However, as she reached the end of the street, her phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. Dread filled her as she answered the call.
It's Mary. I'm back.
The childlike voice whispered, sending a chill down her spine. Jane dropped the phone, her heart pounding with fear. the nightmare was far from over.